Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, friends. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Joe Tatta. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to speak on a panel for the development of a new chronic pain app. There were three of us that were practitioners on that panel. It was myself, a social psychologist, and today's guest, Dr. Natalie Dattilo. And we were fielding questions both from people living with pain as well as practitioners. And I had the opportunity to get to know Natalie, and I wanted to share her with you and introduce you to her because I found her approach to be very refreshing. For me, it was refreshing because even though we know that mental health is finally getting the attention it deserves, both in pain care and other aspects of illness, what I like about Natalie's approach is that she focuses on well-being. She focuses on resilience instead of focusing on what's wrong. She's focusing on what can we improve? How can we improve someone's resiliency so that they can cope and overcome with whatever physical or mental health challenge that they're facing. Natalie is a licensed clinical and health psychologist who specializes in the treatment of depression, anxiety, stress, as well as insomnia. She currently provides psychological evaluation and treatment at Brigham and Women's Hospital and is an instructor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. On today's episode, we discuss the intersection between self-care and resiliency when it comes to living with chronic pain or another challenging health condition. We discuss why self-care is important and how self-care is related to resiliency, how to build resiliency, as well as the barriers that might show up as you start to engage in a self-care routine. The rates of depression, anxiety, as well as chronic pain skyrocketed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is an important episode to share with your friends, your family, as well as the patients that you treat. There's no time like the present to take stock of how you're doing mentally, physically, as well as emotionally, and to develop a self-care routine that will contribute to resiliency. Okay, without further ado, let's begin and let's meet Dr. Natalie Dattilo. Hey there, Natalie. Thanks for joining me this week on the podcast.
Hi, Joe. Nice to be here.
It's nice to meet with you again. I know we met a couple of weeks and we did a little webinar together, me, you, and a social psychologist talking about chronic pain. I love some of the things that you were saying. We were talking mostly to people with chronic pain, but also to some practitioners. And it was great to connect with you and hear a different perspective and learn about your work, both your clinical background and some of the things that you're involved in. And I know you have one of your platforms, one of the things that you're passionate about is self-care. And I think for people with chronic pain or chronic health conditions, when they enter into the healthcare system, self-care is not something that is necessarily talked about right away. It's not necessarily on their mind. And I'm just wondering, one, how did you become so interested in self-care? And I think we should probably define self-care so people understand what it really means.
Okay, no, those are great questions. I'm really interested in self-care as a practitioner, as a clinical psychologist, and I'm working with people who are struggling with things like depression and anxiety alongside some co-occurring medical conditions and really relying on them to practice good self-care. There's only so much that we can do together, and I can bring my tools and we can work on treatments and prevention, but self-care is such a big part of that. And self-care is also about self-empowerment and self-advocacy and feeling empowered to take the best care of yourself that you can. And so that's one of the ways that I define it. Self-care are the intentional steps that we take to tend to our needs too. This is also really important for people who tend to take care of others, and making sure that you're also, filling your cup, making sure that you're taking care of yourself so you really can be available and show up as your best self for the other people that you're taking care of.
I like that. So self-care is really about empowerment.
Empowerment and prevention. I think thinking about self-care as an important preventative care or self-maintenance, as opposed to a reward or something that you get, or it's sort of like a reward or a luxury or a privilege. All of those things, sometimes people think about self-care a little backwards, that it's something that you get to indulge in. but I think it's actually critical and required to stay healthy.
So I just want to give an example of that. So when you say reward,
Mhm.
'cause I know some of these things we can talk about them on like the behavior level and a little bit of the neuropsychological level. If I had a stressful work week
Mhm.
and I say my week was stressful, I worked really hard, had a lot of things going on, I'm going to reward myself with a massage this week.
Mhm.
Does that fit into self-care the way that you're kind of contextualizing it for us?
Yes, I wouldn't rule out massage as a very effective form of self-care. So I mean, I think it can work. There's like a continuum, perhaps, if we think about the practices of self-care and which ones we know are effective. I certainly think rewarding yourself with a massage or an opportunity to unwind at the end of the day or take a long hot bath, if that's the form of self-care that you need, then I think that's the most important part of the equation. It's asking yourself, how am I doing and what do I need? And sometimes, and that's going to change. And sometimes you're going to need a little more. Sometimes you're going to need a little less. Sometimes you're going to need something that feels more pampering. And sometimes you're going to need something that feels more active. Maybe it's practicing assertiveness. Maybe it's checking things off a task list that you've been putting off, with the goal of being productive, but also making sure that you're tending to your needs. And those might also include feeling happy, joy, delight, fun, pleasure.
It's interesting because when I go back and I think about reading other physical therapists' daily notes and evaluations, when I used to do supervision, like in the hospital or in the private practice, or I think back to when I worked in an interdisciplinary program, I don't believe I really saw self-care as like a goal in a lot
Mhm.
of healthcare practitioners' intakes and their goal setting. So it's interesting to think about where that fits in, because so often as professionals, we're thinking, well, we have to treat this, right? And people are coming to us thinking, okay, well, there's potentially something wrong with me. Right now, I can't figure out how self-care fits into that picture.
I do a self-care assessment with the patients that I see. I ask them, what are you doing for self-care? What is your self-care plan? What's your self-care practice? And some people will tell me that they have one and that this is what they tend to do on a regular basis or as often as possible. And some people will look at me like, I don't even know what that would entail.
Mhm.
And then bringing a framework into that conversation to help people make a plan or pick and choose the activities that might be most effective and available for them.
I know you've studied ACT. So in ACT, we talk a lot about avoidance. ACT is acceptance and commitment therapy for those who don't know. Avoidance is a common term used throughout many different professions.
Mhm.
Is there like a covert form of self-care that actually acts as like a form of avoidance where people don't realize they think they're caring for themselves. They think it's a version of self-care, but actually, becomes adversive for them in some way.
No, I think that's a really good question, really good point. Avoidance is something that shows up cross-diagnostically. So we see it in almost every clinical presentation in some form or another. And we develop what I would call anti-avoidance strategies. So how do you know when you are using something as a form of distraction that's healthy? And when are you using something as a form of avoidance, which we would consider unhealthy? And avoidance can show up as experiential avoidance, like an internal avoidance. I'm trying not to feel things internally, or it could be behavioral. You're avoiding people, places, and things because they cause you to have some form of distress. So this is I get this question a lot, actually. So how do I know when I'm avoiding and when I'm using a healthy form of coping like distraction, which can be a very effective form of coping if you're dealing with something that's upsetting to you and you don't have a ready solution to that problem. Sometimes you need to do something else, take your mind off it for a bit and revisit it later. The question that I would ask people is, who's in charge of the behavior, or what's in charge of the behavior, or what's driving the bus?
Mhm.
Are you making the choice, a conscious choice, to step away from the distress that you're experiencing or the problem, and doing something with the goal of feeling better and coming back to it later and be productive? Or is the thing that you're anxious about or avoiding calling the shots here? And even if you know you're avoiding something, as long as you're choosing that as the strategy. I'm choosing to avoid this right now because I really just don't want to deal with it. As soon as you make that a conscious choice, it's no longer avoidance.
Interesting. So
Avoidance tends to happen outside of our awareness of it.
Right, out of our awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So let's give an example. Someone who has chronic pain and they've done too much, kind of past that boom bust cycle, so to speak, and pain just flares. They can't deal with it, and they decide in the middle of the day to take a nap. Healthy, not healthy, self-care, not self-care. Where does that fit into?
It might depend on the consequences as well. So, you've maybe pushed yourself too hard, and maybe the best thing for you to do at that point is to rest, take a nap, lie down. Maybe that is tending to your needs, and I might consider that self-care. And I think the mindset that you bring to the activity or the action is really important. And it's sort of what determines whether this is self-care, whether this is healthy, whether it's unhealthy, or whether it's avoidance, is I'm choosing to do this because I believe this is the best thing for me right now. Right. Now, if that choice has consequences like you're not, you're missing a meeting, you're missing, picking your kids up from school, like there's going to be negative or aversive consequences to that decision. That's when it gets a little bit tricky. And because you don't want to not be tending to the important things in your life as well. That's when it begins to look a little bit more like avoidance and something that's not healthy or productive.
Interesting. So if I'm aware that I did too much, I'm fully aware that I did too much activity, and I chose to take a 10-minute power nap, let's say. I set a timer on my phone, limited amount of time, right? Instead of just napping and waking up whenever I go. I set a 10-minute power nap, and I realize that it helps me in some way self-regulate, whether it's regulate pain, whether it's regulate my distress, my emotional distress. Then that could be a healthy version of self-care that we're talking about.
Yes, I would call that self-care.
Yeah, but if I did too much and I don't realize I did too much, I'm not mindful of that, and I just take a nap, I don't set a timer on the phone, and I just sleep, and it disrupts my sleep cycle for the next day. Probably not the best version of self-care in that sense.
One also feels more self-compassionate, like I'm tending and taking care of myself, and I'm giving myself the rest that my body and the break that my brain might need. And the other is it feels a little bit more destructive or critical, like I'm sort of even like mad at myself or punishing myself for having done too much, as opposed to really taking care of myself in a healthy and compassionate way.
Yeah, I like the word tending that you used. I think that's a good word. It almost reminds me of kind of the relationships we have, like the mother and child when they're younger. There's a tending. There's a need to tend to someone's needs, basically. So obviously we can do that for our loved ones, but we can do that for ourselves as well.
Absolutely. I also think about self-care as self-nurturing, tending to those needs. There's a warmth in that. There's a comfort in that. And I think that feels softer, not forced necessarily.
So I want to just start to move this a little bit, because the idea of self-care obviously can help people with symptom reduction, and that's important for a period of time. But then there's also a resilience building factor to all of this. What's the fine line between resiliency and self-care, as you see? I know there's been some information in the literature about it, and some of it's just things that we talk about as far as professionals.
Well, resilience is a hot topic, obviously, for so many reasons. I think self-care is a critical component of resilience, and resilience is adaptive coping. We talk about it as the ability to bounce back from adversity. And I think self-care is right up there on the list of things that we should and could be doing to help build resilience or cope adaptively in the face of adversity or setback or challenges, which can show up as a physical condition, a pain condition, an emotional condition, or just a really stressful situation. We've been experiencing a prolonged stressful situation for the past year and a half, and our resilience has really been put to the test.
Mhm.
And people have had to get really creative in their self-care because options that might have been available to them prior either weren't available or things have changed so significantly for them in their lifestyle that we've had to get like creative in terms of things that people had never tried before and things that you could do at home.
Mhm. Interesting. And so when you talk about areas of life that affect resiliency,
Mhm.
you mentioned obviously stressful events like the pandemic we've been through.
Mhm.
Where does it start there? So are resiliency factors kind of biological and we're born with them, or are they things that we can develop throughout life?
That's such an interesting question because it's both. We know that there's elements of both at this point, and the idea of thinking about resilience from a bio-psychosocial perspective is new. We've it's mostly fallen into the category of psychological resilience or emotional resilience, but what we know now from recent studies is that there might be biological differences in individuals' ability to be resilient.
Mhm.
And that's really interesting and really important because it opens up other opportunities for intervention and prevention.
Mhm.
The studies that look at resilience, the clinical studies and scientific studies, examine trauma and folks that go on to develop PTSD and those that don't as a way to operationalize and define resilience. And so we are talking about pretty significant forms of adversity that not everybody may experience, but the idea that that there are biological predictors of folks who might go on to develop something like PTSD versus those that don't is really interesting. So I look forward to learning more about that
It's interesting to hear a
in the coming years.
psychologist, as a
Mm-hmm.
psychologist, you're talking about the biology, which is interesting
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because there's,
Well, it's thinking about the anatomical structures in the brain, the neurochemicals that are involved in learning, neuroplasticity, and that there are critical time periods in our life, like across the lifespan, at which we might be more susceptible to the fallout from stress, adversity, and trauma at other times. And the other interesting aspect of looking at resilience over the lifespan is that we are exposed to different risk factors at different points in time in our development. So things that are stressful for children obviously aren't as stressful for adults and vice versa. But yeah, I think the other thing that's interesting about the resilience research is that there's an optimal amount of adversity for humans to experience.
Mm.
So not having any isn't good for us. Having too much, obviously, isn't good for us. But that there is a sweet spot, so to speak, and that as a parent, it is okay to let your kids struggle a little. You don't want them to suffer, obviously, but not letting them struggle deprives them of an opportunity to build resilience. And this we can see in their brains, which is really kind of cool.
So not allowing a struggle to happen it doesn't turn genes on that could help promote that resilience.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it's called stress inoculation. And you can actually give people a little bit, I mean, in the clinical studies that you might look at, you can give people a little bit of stress and watch what happens in their brain and watch what happens in their behavior. And you can actually train people to be better at experiencing stress and adversity and even trauma.
I would think as professionals, that's kind of what we do with things like graded exposure, graded exercise, graded activity, et cetera, where, we realize that someone's coming to us for some kind of change. Ultimately, they're not happy with their life or their health where they are. And we're helping facilitate that change. And at times, once we've given them the skills, we also give them a little bit of a nudge to kind of experiment and try things out, right?
Exactly. We are challenging them. I mean,
Yeah.
this is part of growth and healing. So yes, we are not, we're intentionally putting people in uncomfortable situations that they can handle so that they can also learn that they can handle them and get stronger, grow stronger, get better.
One of the things that I'm very interested in lately is the social context of chronic pain and just chronic disease in general. more from a cultural perspective and like kind of a movement that I believe that we need in our society, probably globally in healthcare. And I really think when you're talking about resiliency and the biological factors, it makes me think of transgenerational trauma. So these are people who obviously have entire histories of trauma that go way back in their family, and it does affect genes and they're passed down. And we're seeing them in clinical practice, obviously, and sometimes we have tremendous success. And then sometimes I have had moments where I've said to myself, I've had 12 visits with this person. They themselves have a whole history of pain and trauma, and their family has a history of pain and trauma. So 12 visits is, not a lot for that patient, not a lot for me. So we need a lot of advocacy, like on the healthcare side, but also like just looking at it from a societal perspective as well to try to remedy some of these challenges.
I think it's such a good point, especially when we're thinking about resiliency and resilience from a bio-psychosocial perspective. So social resilience, what a term, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we build resilience in community or within family? So family resilience, organizational resilience, systemic resilience. I love the idea of talking about community resilience and how we can support one another and lean on one another and learn from our individual models of resilience and extend those out on a more collective and widespread scale. I think there's a lot of value in there, and I'd like to see us do a little bit more work in that area. It might seem contradictory to the concept of self-care, mm-hmm. with this overemphasis on self. I mean, it's right in the title. But I do think there's a relationship, a bidirectional relationship between self-care and community care, and that all are required.
I like that. I can see like a circle: self-care, resiliency, community care. It all just kind of connects. And these are things like people bring this into community centers and churches and schools, and we can affect, larger groups of people that way.
And we take care of each other, we take care of ourselves, and we take care of each other. I also see self-care a little bit differently than others as a form of social responsibility, that when we are able to take care of ourselves or better care of ourselves or tend to our needs in a way that keeps us healthy and out of the healthcare system to the extent that we are able, and have those resources that are scarce, especially in mental health, available to those who need them most when they need them most. I don't know. I not only see self-care as not selfish, I see it as a social responsibility.
Interesting. Okay, so when we look at this self-care resiliency continuum, we have decrease in the impact of trauma and PTSD, if in fact you're exposed to that. And not everyone is adversely affected by that. Some people have the ability to cope with things. Some people need some more skills. Reducing early exposure in life, because that's when our nervous system is growing and is primed and neuroplasticity is happening. What if I asked you what else, or if a patient asked you what else could I do to promote resiliency in my life so I can become a more resilient human or person? What are some kind of skills and tactics they can use?
The number one, studies would show that if you want to know what it is, you cannot overstate the value of positive reappraisal. So from a psychological resilience standpoint, the value of positive reappraisal, which is not putting a positive spin on a negative situation, although it might sound like that. Reappraisal is the process of meaning making or better understanding and approaching adversity from the perspective of learning, growth. It can sometimes look like a silver lining. It can sometimes look like, well, what's the upside here? What is this teaching me? And the ability to do that is so important for adaptive coping and resilience.
So can you give us an example of like maybe a patient you were working with, obviously not mentioning names, or just a clinical example of what reappraisal might look for someone struggling with a chronic health condition, where let's say they're having problems with mobility. That's a big one for many people.
Well, it's not easy to do. But we can get better at it. And it requires thinking about your situation and examining some of the assumptions that you're making about yourself or the situation that you're in, or how long you expect it to last, or how many areas of your life you expect it to affect. And can you think about that situation with more accuracy, or in a way that's going to be more helpful to you, so that you stay motivated, stay inspired, don't get depressed, don't backslide in your progress. But thinking about, the mobility is important, and lack of mobility might be seen as only bad. Mm-hmm. Nothing's ever only anything, right? So there might be aspects of that situation that may be beneficial, that might go too far. But is there something about the situation that you find yourself in right now that's important? Is it teaching you something important about you and about your ability to persevere, your ability to withstand pain, or your ability to withstand difficulties? What is it teaching you about your ability to reach out for help or rely on somebody else for that? What is it teaching you about patience? Right? Some of these are really important coping skills that you are building, like on the spot, when you're dealing with things that you would rather not be dealing with.
Those are really nice open-ended questions, right? People can use with their patients to
absolutely
see what comes up for them, right?
What is this teaching you? It must be teaching you something.
So it's interesting that you mentioned cognitive reappraisal. This is a little technical, but I know you can kind of roll with this for a second. So in ACT, of course, they don't really talk about reappraisal. They talk about cognitive diffusion. Mm-hmm. And they're similar but different. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like it can be as effective versus reappraisal, or is it we need to really learn to cultivate both of them?
Well, my approach is both. I think that there is room for both of those, that they don't have to work in opposition with one another. In some situations and circumstances lend themselves better to each. And so it's knowing which tool to use for the job. But the diffusion strategies are really helpful in separating you from what's on your mind, from the things that you're thinking about, which you also need to do in order to reappraise them. So you have to take that step back and think about what you're thinking about and metacognate, so that you can decide, is this a situation that's susceptible to reappraisal, or do I need another approach, which is just being very curious about what it is that I'm thinking, being very curious about my experience, and just observing what it is that I'm thinking about it without necessarily trying to change it.
Right. So I have to be able to notice my thoughts or observe my thoughts first. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the reappraisal process.
Yes.
Yeah. That's so important.
And you get to be in a position to decide what to do with those thoughts.
Yeah. That's
you get to decide whether this is a helpful thought for me. Does this make me feel better? Does this make me feel worse? Does this make me feel more encouraged, discouraged? What is the value or purpose of that thought? Can I change it? If I could just change it, I'll just change it. And if not, can I just change the way that I relate to it?
Mm-hmm. Do you think, so a patient asked me a while ago, because we were talking about some of her thoughts related to pain and how it impacts her function. And she said, I understand all this. She said, can I just be with this thought for a couple of days and then come back and work with it? And it was such a curious comment that she made. And it wasn't the worst thought. I wasn't concerned that she was going to harm herself or had a plan to harm herself or anything. And I said, sure. I said, actually just observing that thought and seeing what happens with it, if it changes or if it morphs, it becomes more positive maybe, or just maybe stays exactly the way it is, maybe becomes more intense in your body, maybe it doesn't. And within about a week's time, she came back and she said, me staying with it caused it to go away. Mm-hmm. I thought it was so interesting.
Yes. And I love that. I really do. I love it. The idea of making room for thought, and even I have people kind of put it in their imaginary backpack and carry it around with them. And it doesn't have to do anything or mean anything. It's just there. And you can decide later what it is that you want to do with it. But being observant of that, taking a more neutral stance around that, these are skills that you can teach people and get better at. over time. Curiosity is also a really important, if you cultivating curiosity. I say curiosity is the great neutralizer. And it requires being observant. It requires stepping away from the things that you're thinking about or whatever it is that you're experiencing internally, and just getting kind of interested in it. Like, that's really interesting, or that's really weird, or why is that happening? And just being curious about your own experience takes you automatically into a more neutral space. And it's very rewarding to the brain. It's just sort of inherently rewarding to the brain to be curious about something. So you feel better.
So I want to drop down into the body for a minute, because we've been talking a lot about thoughts and the mind with regard to resiliency, kind of the bottom-up mechanisms, as we say: exercise, physical activity, movement, working with the somatic body, working with the autonomic nervous system, which is typically below the neck. Where does movement and physical activity fit into not only self-care, but resiliency? I think is even more important to discuss.
Exercise, physical movement, physical activity is at the top of my list. Whenever I'm working with someone, I want to check in about what kind of exercise they're doing, what kind of physical activity they're able to do. It's right at the top of my list when it comes to self-care, and for all sorts of reasons. So the mobility is really important. It's for managing stress, managing anxiety, managing mood, using the body to, just activate the brain, activate the body, activate the biology, get everything circulating in the right way. You just feel better. Exercise, we know, strengthens the part of the brain that's sensitive to pleasure. And so, when you exercise, it actually makes everything you do more pleasurable, more enjoyable. So that's really important. It also sends an important message back to us about how we're doing. So there's this behavioral biofeedback mechanism where when you're active, you see yourself being active, and you tell yourself important things about how you're doing and what you're capable of as you're being active, as you sort of see yourself as somebody that moves their body on a regular basis. That does a lot for our confidence. That does a lot for motivation. And so I think there's just so many levels and layers to that one thing that it's just so critically important.
One of the things that really concerned me during the pandemic was obviously homeschooling, which, we had to do for a period of time. But I was concerned about adolescents, of course, with regard to physical activity, but more so young children, very young children, because we know that cognitive development, oftentimes tracks with motor development and vice versa. And I don't think we make that connection in early years so well. We think, well, kids have to go to school, they have to learn, they have to sit down and read and write and math. But motor learning, being physically active, boosts a lot of that process and that development.
Such a good point. And you're right. I think we've lost some of that. I think we were losing that battle maybe a little bit before with devices and being inside. And we really do need to encourage our kids to move more for exactly that reason. Those parts of the brain need to connect with the learning centers of the brain and the emotional regulation centers of the brain. And a well-connected brain is a healthy brain. So the more you're engaging motor cortex and linking that up with executive functioning and critical thinking, creativity, all of those things are really important. I think as adults, we move, if we're doing intentional and planned exercise and activity, we move. We probably don't move enough, but what we don't do enough is play.
Yeah, that's so true.
I consider that an important part of self-care too.
Yeah, which is so good for neuroplasticity, play.
Mm-hmm.
If someone's listening and they're sitting down right now, if you're at home, you can take out a pen and paper or maybe your journal and start to write some of these ideas down, maybe set up a plan for yourself. It's typical that people would maybe set some goals for themselves, like exercise twice a week for 20 minutes, maybe develop a meditation practice, crossword puzzles. All these things are good for resiliency. Should we change up our routine? And is that beneficial for our self-care routine and for resiliency?
It might be. It might be worth taking a look at what you're doing during the week. And do you have time and space and energy to add items. Some people do, and if it's important and you prioritize self-care, then it might be worth having planned self-care activities, at least if not daily, weekly. So yes, I do encourage people being very intentional in planning their self-care, but sometimes we're busy. And the idea of doing something else or adding another thing to that to-do list, there isn't time or room for that. So I encourage people to make the things that they're already doing every day a form of self-care or an act of self-care. So if it's a cup of coffee that you're going to have anyway, maybe take a little bit of time with that. So slow down, drink that, and savor that instead of kind of running out the door with it. Or meals. Meals are a great time to practice self-care and engage the senses and really pay attention to what you're doing, or practice gratitude before a meal, those sorts of things. It doesn't actually take a lot more effort or time. It just takes more intention.
Mm. And I know talking about this is important because over our 35 minutes here, I started my day with, I don't have time to do my run today. Mm-hmm. And I was going to put it off till tomorrow. And now I'm thinking to myself, I have time. I can fit that in. I can kind of work this in somehow. So just talking about this, brings things to the surface and you realize, okay, this is important to me. This is something that is valuable for my brain and my body. And I have a friend that I run with sometimes. So there's a social component there. So just talking about this is, I think, so valuable for people.
Yes, there are a few non-negotiables that I have that I have to get done, that I also enjoy doing. So it's not a have to, it's also a want to. But I know when those things start to go, I'm in trouble. So.
It's been great speaking with you today, Natalie, about stress and resiliency and self-care, all really important topics. Tell our listeners and viewers how they can learn more about you.
Okay, well, I'm on Instagram. I'm Dr. Natalie Christine on Instagram. That's my handle. I'm also on Twitter, and that's Natalie_Dattilo. And I have a website, drnataliechristine.com, where I have a blog and I post about topics related to mindset, motivation, and self-care.
Awesome. So you can check out her website. It's drnataliechristine.com, pretty easy. And you can tweet her, hey, what I would love for you to do is take a screenshot with your phone and share that on Instagram and tag both Natalie and myself. So it's at Natalie Dattilo, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at
on Twitter. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And at Dr. Joe Tatta. So you can tag both of us and let us know how you like today's episode. I think there were lots of valuable nuggets here, and both the science part of it as well as kind of the take-home pieces you can do. At the end of every podcast, I may ask you to share this with your friends and family on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, anywhere people are talking about self-care and resilience to help them. I want to thank Natalie again for joining me this week. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.